that possibility.
Okay, so that's replacing misandry.
Yes.
And then in your final volume, unless you come up with other angles, because this issue is so broad,
Yeah.
there will be transcending misandry.
That's right.
Misandry.
Yeah. Well,
So you've got the five.
both books are written. Both are at McGill Queen's Press
I
at
was
the
going to ask
moment.
you, when can we expect to get
Well,
them,
they're still under
online,
review.
right?
So they'll come back from the reviewing process, and if they pass, as the others have, then I have to do all the copy editing and the indexing. It could take a year.
Okay. It's worth the wait.
Oh, it is. Yeah. Well, after
And it
25
was
years.
worth the wait putting tonight's event on, too. I enjoyed our talk. Professor Paul Nathanson, Religious Studies, McGill, 3 books so far. You can see the 3 of them here. Spreading, I'm going to keep mispronouncing it. Misandry. Spreading Misandry, Legalizing Misandry, and Sanctifying Misandry. And then within a year, hopefully, we'll be seeing on the shelves
Replacing
Misandry and
Transcending
Misandry. Thank you. Okay. We'll probably have to rest out, but if there are questions, please.
I want that business about identity in, because that's
I'm going to send it to you
that's
before
the crux of the
before
whole
it goes
thing.
up. Yeah, you can tell me if you want anything in or out. Don't worry about that. Please.
Yeah, I actually had 3 questions, so I don't know if I should just ask one after the other.
Do you mind being on film?
I don't.
You don't mind?
So.
Okay. I'll just, yeah, so you can get a few different faces on. Yeah.
Should I
Go
just
for it.
ask them sort of all in one block?
Why don't you ask them one at a time? Yeah, just for better dialogue.
So my first question is pretty broad, I guess. It's about the university, the percentage of gender, at university, at least for undergraduate, as you were mentioning earlier. I'm just wondering, given that, as you said, there is about 60% of undergraduates who are girls, I was wondering, how do you think university can, and I'm saying university as a whole, can reconcile or deal with, because I assume that this affects in a way or another the narrative of the different disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
You seem to agree, so how do you think we can deal with that?
Well, I don't. That's a hard question to answer, because the obvious solution, which is affirmative action, we've argued against affirmative action. It's an inherently unfair system. It now applies. We have affirmative action programs at McGill to get women in. So one solution would be just to say, well, no, we've got to switch and get men in. But I'm very uncertain about the moral foundation of the whole notion of affirmative action. So the ultimate solution is to make it acceptable for men to be interested in academic work. I mean, it is not exactly part of the masculine ideal, certainly not what you see in popular culture, where, it's assumed that to be a man or a young man is, to live in a filthy house and play video games all day, and so how do you make academic work masculine, or at least acceptable as part of masculine? So that's the kind of thing that I think ultimately we have to work with. We've got to get men interested in doing this.
Yeah.
Now, some cultures are a lot better at it than others. There's a wide range. In the culture that I grew up in, Judaism, scholarship is very, very masculine. That's considered a defining feature of masculine identity. So there's a wide range, but it's a cultural problem, I think, that we need to deal with, and I'm not sure that institutional tinkering is the best answer, but I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Next.
So my second question, I guess the 2 other ones actually are more sort of, you'll see the link with my own interests. The first is, you were actually just mentioning the sort of cultural aspect of the problem. I'm wondering if, across your research, if you found out that there were any, maybe there was any overall difference between the way the male is perceived, or men are perceived in the popular culture in North America and the way it's perceived in Europe. I've got my own opinion of that because I grew up here, but I'm of a European background, so I would like to hear you now.
Well, are you interested in cultural differences? Or are you interested in the role of culture and nature?
Perhaps more cultural. Like
Culture, okay.
interest in the popular-
Okay, because that's a whole other controversy.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, of course there are cultural differences. And I'm not familiar enough with the nuances of various European cultures. So I don't really know what the differences are. I don't even know what the stats are in Europe for college attendance, or maybe you can tell me, I don't know.
I don't know. As I said, I grew up here, but I meant popular culture, that is the way men are perceived in respective popular cultures. That's more what I was wondering.
Well, I'll tell you what I suspect. I can only tell you that. I mean, I see European movies. British movies are not very different from American. But my sense is that that the level of juvenility in American movies is probably distinctive. I somehow doubt that in Germany they would present men as being the idiots that you see routinely in American movies. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. And in any case, even if there were a difference, people in Europe like American movies. So I don't know how much difference there is at this point.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I think it's certainly a problem in terms of how, as you say, American movies, or that sort of entire American movie industry at least, just sort of almost evens out, if one can say, just cultural perceptions and just cultures to a certain extent. Obviously, there is always a certain cultural endemism, if I can say, but I think it's sort of by spreading it sort of evens out the way people perceive.
Well, yes, I mean popular culture, any mass culture is going to even out differences.
Yeah, and I see it just in commercials that are from Sweden, from France, from Great Britain, how men sometimes, say in one particular theme, say beer, I mean the portrait or the depiction essentially of the man is pretty much the same across cultures in those commercials. This is just an example.
Oh, I could tell you stories about commercials. There was one commercial, and I cannot remember the name of the car company. It could have been Toyota or one of those. But you see this car parked in the forest somewhere, and four men get out, and as they get out, they fall on their face, they throw out all their garbage on the ground, they make a fool of them, and then the camera pans to behind a tree some distance away, and you have four women, obviously the wives, watching and laughing as the men make fools of themselves. That was a classic, but there are countless commercials like that. Okay, what's next?
Then I was just wondering from what was it? So this is a really broad question. I don't know if it makes sense, but I just wanted to ask it. Do you think, according to your research or from what you know, do you think there's a relatively significant legacy of indigenous cultures, say just for the example of North America, in terms of, for instance, in this region, how indigenous cultures tend to be, say, in the Iroquoian family, tend to be more matrilineal or matriarchal. Do you think that this, in a way, has played on the way, again, the males are perceived or portrayed in popular culture, or even in the culture of this country?
I doubt it. I doubt it. I'm not aware that there's any cultural influence going in that direction. I mean, yes, you have movies like Dances with Wolves, and they present an incredibly romanticized view of Indian cultures. They're in harmony with nature, and but it's a very, very romanticized view. I don't think there's any knowledge whatsoever about those cultures among the rest of the population.
You don't think it would be possible that such previous cultures or ways of life would have affected in a way or another either the legal frameworks or the broad cultural perception of males or anything.
I can't speak for the future, but I doubt very much that it's done that yet. And it's not likely to do in the near future because those cultures are in very bad shape. They seem to be disintegrating. They're not, and so it's not a situation that is likely to recommend their structures, their social structures, to others.
Okay. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to
Come on.
get in on there?
I have a couple questions.
Do you mind if we film you?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
Alright, so throughout the discussion, I heard a lot of distinctions being made between the roles of men and women in Misandry. And I was wondering,
Roles.
like, there are parts there, obviously, Misandry requires that there are men being either contempt being expressed for them or hatred being shown towards them. And women were also brought up a lot as a category. I was just wondering what you think the role, is there a space or a role for transgender, transsexual, intersex, or otherwise genderqueer individuals in Misandry, how you see that? Because we haven't talked about.
You mean, does misandry include prejudice against transsexuals, or is that what you're saying?
I'm just wondering, like, do you think that it does? Do you think?
No, I think that they get a free pass.
Okay. Do you think they're perpetrators?
Yes, I would say in some cases. I mean, look, I'm only familiar with gay people, but but certainly gay people are by no means free of the universal taint of prejudice. What happened with it? Now, it's interesting that you asked. It's an interesting question because one of the things that happened with the gay movement was that they, at a very early stage, began to see that they created an alliance with feminists because feminists were challenging gender categories, and so they said, hey, well, that's what we're doing. So they made this alliance. I think that it was an unfortunate alliance because what it meant was that gay men began defining themselves not as men. Men were still the other, even to them, even though they had male bodies. They saw themselves, to some extent, as honorary women. And I think that has created a problem. In other words, the ideal solution would have been for gay people to create some kind of bridge between men and women. But instead, it went the other way. They threw in their lot with feminism, and they said, hey, we're good men. It's those others that are bad. Now, that was, I think, a very unfortunate political choice.
Okay.
Now, obviously, that doesn't apply to all gay men, but politically, that has been the pattern.
Okay. I know often in sexual assault workshops and also in a lot of my women's studies classes, if anyone goes on a certain tangent, often one of us will be like, hey, let's call it back a second. Remember that in these situations, who is a victim or survivor or who the perpetrator might be they're very blended categories, and we have to realize that sometimes it is women that are the ones that are anti-feminist, obviously. So I was just wondering, in the discussion, women were really posted as the perpetrators, especially feminists, and I was just wondering if you don't see this as problematic.
Oh wait, well, I haven't even read the poster. What does it say?
Oh no, in the discussion, it was kind of set up in the sense that feminists were usually, women generally, but feminists especially, were mentioned as kind of the perpetrators. Ideological feminists. Okay.
And we make the distinction very clear in a whole chapter, and we insisted that every time the word feminist appeared in this book, unless it really were a general statement, which is very seldom, we would always put either egalitarian or ideological in front.
Okay, so it's just kind of interesting that egalitarian feminism is seen as almost an ally, whereas ideological feminism is seen as almost an enemy.
Actually, I hate to say, and this is something that didn't occur to me originally, and that is that egalitarian feminism also presents a problem, it's not a conscious, willful choice. The problem is simply inherent in the whole, in the interpretation of equality as sameness. Once you make that shift, then you have a problem, because if we're all the same, then what's the point? What do men do? What is our place? Women are always going to be mothers. And there's always going to be that asymmetry. But what are men going to do that is equivalent to that? What distinctive identity? And I think that for all the goodwill in the world, egalitarian feminists don't really ask that question. In fact, nobody really asks that question, but it's an important question.
I think that's interesting because, especially in terms of third wave feminism as being distinctive from second wave feminism, I know there's been a lot of discussion around the essentialization of gender in general. And I know of a professor at York University whose research really, and her grad students also, focus around why are mothers mothers, in the sense that when you think of the word mother, it's not, oh, I produced this child.
No.
It's literally like the caring, the warm, the fuzzy things that you also described. And it's just, so I think there really is a start. I'm saying by no means that it's complete, but I think there is a beginning that is challenging gender essentialization in general, what it means to be a woman, like who says that motherhood is a female equals motherhood in lots of ways, and like this is problematic for women, it's problematic for men, because then if women are mothers, where are men as fathers? And it's just part of a larger discussion.
Yeah, and that is precisely the kind of thing that we hope dialogue will facilitate. It's exactly that kind of thing.
Okay, it's just like earlier when you mentioned.
But it has to be by dialogue. There have to be two voices. So at the moment, you're saying that women are talking about that, which is great, but we've got to get men and women talking about it.
Well, one of the graduate students that I know was identified as male. So it's just, I guess it depends. But so when you talked about how there's masculinity courses coming into play here, and you're wondering why they're in the women's studies departments, it's, on the one hand, it's like, well, masculinity, what makes masculinity necessarily belong to men, or what makes femininity essential to women? And maybe it's something that everyone should have a voice in, that we can actually find a solution that works for the most people possible.
I have no objection to courses on masculinity in women's studies, as long as it's not just an excuse to dump on men. If they're really looking at men and listening to men and reading male authors or whatever, that's fine. But I think ultimately we have got to stop segregating men's studies and women's studies.
Which lots of universities are under gender studies.
Now, not all courses on men, even if they're, whatever their origin or whatever their department, are not necessarily things that I look with approval at, because, there's a whole bunch of men who are, they come out of this movement that began with Robert Bly, the mythopoetic, and going out into the forest for retreats and beating tom-toms, and there's all this kind of stuff, which of course they borrowed directly from women who were doing similar things. But their assumption is that the problems that men have they're all in here. So if you just psych yourself out in some way or other, you will solve the problem. But we're saying that although plenty of men have, inner psychological problems, but there are problems in the real world, historical, technological, economic, legal, And they cannot be solved with pop psychology. They have to be dealt with. So, and this came out in an article, another problem I had a few weeks ago. There was this article on men's studies also in the Gazette.
At Concordia?
Yes, they were mentioned.
Okay.
And I was mentioned, Catherine and I were mentioned. I had my picture, nice picture actually, of the few nice pictures I ever took. But we were basically a segue. You know, she gave us about 3 sentences, and then she said, but, and then she went on with the people that she really approved of. And those are the people like La France and a few others who, look, for all I know, maybe these are really intelligent, insightful people who are doing great work, but they weren't presented that way in the article. They were presented as saying all the